Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to try and do the impossible in an hour and summarise 45 years of a UFO experience in my talk.
Excuse me, Bill, this isn't good enough. We need it solid. That's better.
Okay. Okay, brief commercial plug. I've got one copy each of these books, and I think Peter Curry, who's here today, has also got 3 more copies of Hair of the Alien. Okay. I'll skip all the introduction that's been ably covered. My baptism of UFO fire occurred in 1973 when I was at the University of New England doing a science degree, and it was a seriously weird time. And what was really unique about it was that as a UFO researcher, I was also able to be a UFO witness. And the first slide here is at the bottom here, sort of a representation of my daylight disc sighting that I had coming up back from university, a 4-hour chemistry prac, seeing an egg-shaped metallic object passing overhead, unable to identify it, other witnesses as well. On the same day, outside at Mount Butler was a very strange event involving kind of an apparitional thing, and that area at Mount Butler became like what I call a UFO hot zone. Frequent sightings and that kind of thing. It was just a very strange period. What seems to got seriously weird the following year in 1973 at a place called Tyringham. Tyringham, if you drive through it, if you blink, you'll miss it. It's basically a couple of buildings, a store, and it services a lot of farms around there on the Dorrigo Plateau. Now, for a period of about 2 or 3 months during 1973, there was repeated activity, literally hundreds of sightings, so frequent that I was able to take myself and a team of people down almost on every weekend for that period of time. We saw lots of things, tried to physically record it. Extremely difficult, very elusive phenomena. It was a really extraordinary time. To summarise some of the things that were there, we saw agile nocturnal lights, possible landing events, aerial objects, unusual auditory phenomena. We christened them phantom truck noises. A lot of these events were associated with clock stopping, electrical effects. There were very strange situations that I guess you could put into the paranormal, like shared visions, dreams, encounters, deja vu of the UFO kind. I'm not going to be able to obviously go into a lot of detail about individual events, but a lot of that's caught up in this documentation on my website, in these books, magazines, that kind of stuff I've published fairly extensively. So you should be able to, if you're interested in any aspect, you'll be able to find details about it. UFOs were photographed, and I witnessed a lot of it myself, so it was a pretty interesting time. So to give you a quick idea of what was involved, we had sightings of, this is something I'll get into at the end of my talk, what appeared to be like a projection of unusual light from beneath the UFO. You see this sort of like a wedge-shaped thing coming out of the bottom of the object that would go in and out like a tongue type thing, up and down. It was quite unusual. There were close encounters on the ground of objects sitting on the ground within 100 metres of the people. The photograph, sort of extraordinary nocturnal light sightings, object flashing by, stops dead, does a reverse upper U-turn, and then drops down like a stone, and then lights up the entire mountain. That kind of stuff happened so frequently, it was just bizarre. But the one thing that was a cornerstone of all this was the elusiveness. It was like they were playing a game with us. We would get set, have heavy-duty camera tripod equipment where the sightings have been occurring behind mountains night after night, have it all trained in that direction. What would happen? It would be happening behind us. So it was just a crazy kind of period. One of the few photographs that we recorded during that period. Again, the sighting at Darraba, which is a little village near to Tyringham as well. Sort of lots of unusual events, columns of light, things sitting on top of mountains where they shouldn't be, that kind of thing, close encounters, objects doing falling leaf motion and seemingly landing behind the mountain. Now this is just a personal close encounter that I had with a friend, school friend who went through university. I did science, he did economics. The reason why he was interested in coming with me to Tyringham the previous year, he had had a close encounter at Gorrar on the New South Wales-Queensland border, a very close encounter, which I wrote up in Flying Saucer Review in 1972. And that's a drawing of his experience, kind of like a Min Min light, but extremely close, within metres of his tractor while I was doing night ploughing. Now he joined me on one of my many trips to Tyringham, and we decided we're going to stay the night, and we're staying on a property nearby, and we saw all this light activity up behind the property, went up there and investigated. I describe it a fair bit in my book, The Oz Files, and it was a really peculiar event. I guess a close encounter with some strange lights, that kind of thing. Now, as I said, this got very strange. This particular event, by this stage in August of 1973, I was regularly driving around the area. One of my cardinal rules was I never told anybody about what I experienced. I was just like a human vacuum cleaner, absorbing information from farmers, locals, living in the area, trying to figure out what the hell was going on, and also obviously trying to witness it myself. Now this occurred around about midnight. One of these so-called phantom truck noises started. I race outside. I'm standing directly underneath this very intense droning sound of buzzing bees, and thinking this is pretty strange, what's going to happen? Then all of a sudden I experienced this cold column of air, put my hand through it. I could physically define the space of this column of air, and then it went away. By that stage I'm starting to think maybe I'm really tired, maybe this is all a hallucination. Then from the trees there was like a bright light that appeared that shone a beam of light down onto the farmhouse that I was staying at, and that was lighting up the whole house. It went out, and then from that same direction a egg-shaped metallic object sort of passed over, came up from behind the trees and passed overhead. And it looked almost identical to the object that I'd seen in daylight, a daylight egg-shaped disc. And it disappeared. Now, by that stage, I hung around waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did, so I went to sleep. Next morning, the wife of the electronics technician that lived in the property, we were having breakfast, and he's saying, "Bill, tell Bill about your dream." And he said, "No, he doesn't want to hear about my dreams," but she was experiencing the flu, so she wasn't real well at that point. Anyway, she told me about the dream. Her dream was that she dreamed that she saw a transparent egg-shaped type dome thing, which I show in the drawing there, flying over virtually the same area at about the same time that I'm physically outside experiencing my own sightings. So I don't know what to make of it, but it was a pretty strange event. So that's just photographs from the time. Cockatoo Creek, that was also a location of a deja vu type of experience of a woman who lived in Sydney with her husband, seeing, like she had this recurring daylight dream and kept having these visions, and it was the vision of seeing a country space with discs or objects passing overhead. She had no idea what this was about. She's living in the city. A few months later they moved to Cockatoo Creek, which is just up the road from Tyringham, and about a couple of months later they had just completed a kitchen extension to the house they were in. She's standing at the kitchen window and she looks out the window and she realises this is the window or the vision that she was seeing months earlier in this recurring daylight dream. And the only thing that was different was that there were no UFOs or no discs passing over, but the UFO flap that occurred in Tyringham for many months occurred about a month later. So deja vu, whatever, or premonition, Who knows? So you can understand why Tyringham represents one of my favourite UFO hot zones. There has been phenomena recurring there, but the people there, they're all basically farming types or people that have dropped out or whatever, or trying to do an alternative lifestyle, that kind of stuff. And you really have to know the people. Like my last trip there, 2010, I roll up to the so-called corner store. There is no corner in Tyringham. It's just a shop that sits there, but they call themselves the corner store. And I go in, have a chat, anything happening. They didn't know who I was, and said, no, nothing weird happens around here. And then I sort of said, whatever happened to Jan? And she said, Jan's my mum. I said, hi, yeah, I'm Bill Chalker. And she said, right. Oh, yeah, we just had a close encounter only a couple of months ago behind the store up there. So if you're basically not connected with the people, you won't get to know what's going on, basically. So it was very interesting that activity was still continuing in Tyringham. When the book Hunt for the Skinwalker came out, very good book, worthwhile reading, it focused on another one of these UFO hot zones in Utah, and it had been studied back in 1974 originally by Frank Salisbury, a biologist, he wrote the book Utah UFO Display. A revision of his earlier book has come out as well, called the Utah UFO Display again. All those focus on this one location, but when I read Hunt for the Skinwalker and all the rest of it and heard about that, it was like deja vu for me, because it was kind of like the same sort of phenomenon that was going on in Tyringham back in the 70s. Now, Paul mentioned the UFO handbook. That to me was kind of like a Bible. I bought something about 10 copies of it when it came out. I even contemplated giving the RAAF a copy of the UFO handbook so they could improve their UFO investigation techniques. I decided that would have been a waste of money. Sorry if there are any RAAF people here, but anyway. Having looked at the RAAF files, it is a cross-section of the kind of confusion, some good case investigations in the minority, and a lot of misidentifications, IFOs, that kind of thing, but a cross-section of close encounters and unusual cases, etc. What they did with the more puzzling cases, they had a very novel kind of response. That was basically to ignore them. So that was their response to the core UFO phenomenon. But really the UFO handbook represents a really good guide, and I hope it gets reissued. It's a fantastic book. But it basically highlights the need to actually investigate and really report on what you investigate. Look at the whole question of IFOs, or identified flying objects, because there's a lot of things out there that can be misinterpreted, mistaken, and with drones becoming so prolific, it's getting harder and harder to try and differentiate between UFOs and drones and that kind of thing. But drones don't readily explain a lot of close encounter cases. There's lots of other guides doing the rounds. You've got your MUFON field investigation manual. You've got Chase Gillespie's admissible book, great handbook, but lots of other things as well. Jenny Randall's UFO study, that's actually available in a digital form on the internet, free, I think. Last time I looked it was. Now, just to get to the core of my talk, I'm going to talk about 8 different case types and my experience with some of them. Obviously, this is going to be a really light touch, basically the tip of a very, very big iceberg. So you can't, if you've got a couple of months to spend with me, maybe I could tell you about the entire 45 years of research, but in 1 hour it's going to be very difficult. Okay, so these are the case types, and just to lighten it up a bit, one of my favourite jokes or cartoons about UFOs. Family having a picnic, sees a UFO, the parents bow down and start to pray to the UFO. It becomes a set of smiling lips, and then it disappears, and the comment is, "Oh, fickle you UFO." In Australia, the fickle could have been something else, but historical cases. Now, this is one of my favourite areas. I have a special passion for looking for historical cases. Now, why are they important? they could be evidence for how long UFOs have been around, and particularly important is if you get a historical case that confirms modern aspects, that sort of verifies that there is a kind of a UFO reality that's been around for a long, long time. Now, I'm only going to cover two cases, two of my favourite cases, and these two cases show that you can do an awful lot with historical cases, even if the witnesses aren't around anymore. In one case they were, but in the first case not. Now, the first case took place in 1868. That's a long time ago, Parramatta Park. And in 1975, when I first came to Sydney, after doing 4 years of university study at Armidale, I was handed a document by the Honorary President of VUFOA, the group that I coordinate today, Fred Phillips, and it was a document called basically a copy of the memorandum book of Frederick William Birmingham, who was a surveyor and alderman of Parramatta Council, and in it he described his vision of an object that landed in Parramatta Park, and this was a really strange document, and I puzzled over it for quite a long time, investigated it thoroughly. I got really excited when I verified that Birmingham was in fact a real person, that he was a surveyor, there were maps drawn by him, there were council meeting minutes and all that kind of thing, so a real guy. But one of the things about historical UFO research is it pays to have patience. Now, this is something I've published recently, but these are drawings. I've coloured them in a little bit to jazz them up a bit, but this shows the movement of the object, the flying ark as he referred to it, landing in Parramatta Park. And he's taken on board, he meets with what he calls the spirit, and he's shown equations, and one of these equations was related to centrifugal pumps. What it all means, I have no idea. But I always had this sort of little recurring doubt that it was some form of historical hoax. But extraordinarily, within the last couple of years, we've had a couple of verifications that this was known and it was verified. This is a photograph of Mr. Cox, who was Mayor of Parramatta and Dundas in the late 1880s. And in 1932, he recollected, this is about a few months before he died, about the age of 92 or something of that order, and he's telling the reporter of the Sydney Morning Herald some of his reminiscences about historical Parramatta. And then he says in the parting paragraph, "Oh, did I ever tell you about Birmingham?" And then he goes on to describe Birmingham had this vision of a strange airship, and that he actually used that vision to make a model and to try to make a flying machine based on what he experienced in 1868. So that, when I heard that, it was really exciting stuff, because it kind of verified the document that I received in 1975. Now, there was a further verification by a chap called Herbert Rumsey, who turned out to be the first president of the Australian Society of Genealogy. Now, he was one of these borrowers who dug down deep and did a lot of historical family research, that kind of thing. And in 1911, in 1911, he wrote in response to a person's query about who surveyed Melbourne, you have to bring it all back to Melbourne, he said one of the early surveyors of Melbourne was Frederick William Birmingham, and that he had actually known Frederick Birmingham, and Birmingham had told him the story and given him copies of the document. And I think it's possibly the document and a bit more of what I received in 1975. But in 1911, he's actually verifying that this early days surveyor actually had witnessed a strange vision of an object that landed in Parramatta Park in 1868, and he used that to actually make his own kind of flying craft. Now, he got so obsessed by it that he made a model. He tried to get investors interested in it to create the object and to create the flying model, and also took it to America, where he languished for about 2 or 3 years to try and get investors to make this flying machine. Now, bear in mind this is way back in 1882, and unfortunately none of the Americans were interested enough, and he almost starved to death. And it was when Parramatta people like Mayor Cox and others and friends found out that poor old Birmingham was almost starving in New York and California, they saved up enough money to pay for his return. And there's a little notice in one of the Sydney papers saying, return of an elderly Parramatta surveyor and alderman with his flying machine model. And it actually makes that mention in the local papers. So with patience you can find out an awful lot about these stories. Okay, now the other early historical case that I really got stuck into big time was 1927, Fernvale. Luckily, the witness still lived and was 10 years old at the time, and I got to meet him and his sister, who both witnessed this. Now, this was a really strange story. Infestation of nocturnal light sightings, an object that appears to land on the property, extensive disturbances in local livestock, the cows, cattle mutilation, pig mutilation, and sightings of a strange, very large bird-like creature that did some pretty strange things in the area. Now this I was able to investigate on site, and there were also old historical photographs taken as well. Paintings done by the main witness, Cecil McGann. His sister Dot did these paintings. I was able to verify these with historical photographs and also on site. This is Cecil. Cecil as he was when I last met him. We did some extensive video interviews with him as well. Locals there, Barry Roach was the neighbour who I think married into the McGann family as well, but he had a lot of these old historical photographs. He took me to the location, and using a lot of this we were able to get the location sorted out. And local historian Ron Johansson actually went to school with Cecil McGann. He remembered Cecil and the family talking about this pretty strange stuff happening back in Fernvale in 1927. Now, if this all sounds like you've heard this story before, well, you have, but you had to wait. Well, this is the letter that Cecil first wrote to me. It took him about a year to write this letter, and I get this 15-page letter talking about this extraordinary thing that he called an early visitor. This is the bird-like creature that he saw, an elephant man type thing with a figure that seemed to wander around that had a large trunk-like thing. The elephant creature. Now, why you might have a memory of this, that 40 years later, in 1967 or thereabouts, that's when John Keel's The Mothman Prophecy played out in West Virginia at Point Pleasant. And it's kind of like a 40 years later, a rerun of Fernvale in 1927. So pretty interesting stuff. Now, as a chemist, a physical chemist, physical traces are really of great interest to me, and I've studied hundreds of physical trace cases, UFO landing cases around Australia, and I'm only going to cover two in a little bit of detail. But the importance of this is that physical trace cases, when you examine them, investigate them on site and do the chemistry and all the rest of it, the analysis, they can provide really potent evidence, important evidence for the physical reality of UFOs. Only problem is that the UFO landing cases, physical traces landing cases, have been somewhat diluted because of the appearance of crop circle cases. Now, I try not to get into arguments and discussions about crop circles because it gets pretty emotive, but to me, UK-style crop circles do not appear to be UFO related. That's my own personal opinion. But UFO physical trace cases where you get a direct correlation between a UFO and a landing, where marks are found, are rare, but they still happen. But they get drowned out these days by crop circle stories. So now, this case, George Pedley's case, is a very famous daylight sighting, 9 o'clock in the morning, 1966. Cheryl Gotchell, who's here, can tell you an awful lot about that. It happened in her home state. I've been up there into the lagoon. I actually swam into the lagoon in the early 70s. I also flew out of the lagoon very quickly when one of Albert Panisi's sons told me that you better be worried about taipans. So I cleared out of the water very, very fast at that stage. A couple of dogs got killed off by the taipans, but George was a very nice guy, but very private and reluctant to talk about it, but he did talk to people who were seriously interested in finding out what he saw. He's driving a tractor past, daylight, taking a shortcut through his neighbour Albert Panisi's property at a place called Horseshoe Lagoon. And he sees this. He sees this object rise up out of the lagoon, do a bit of a dip and take off at high speed. Now, the Air Force did an investigation and suggested that this was a willy-willy, and that what they'd seen was all the swordgrass reeds ripped out of the lagoon and taken up, shaped like a flying saucer. So, only problem for that explanation was that the swordgrass was still there and still in the lagoon, but matted together in a very tightly woven mass that floated on the surface of the lagoon like a floating pontoon. And there's a lot of early photographs here that show George and Albert. That's George Pedley standing there with the lagoon behind him. Albert sitting on top of the floating pontoon of swordgrass, and Albert Panisi and myself at the 2006, wasn't it, conference that UFO Research Queensland put on, and the highlight for me of that entire conference was meeting Albert again and Albert's sons again. Then I could blame which son told me about the taipans, and but unfortunately that was Albert's last public talk, to the best of my knowledge, and it was really lovely to catch up with them again. Fortunately, one of the sons is looking after the property and wants to keep it pretty much as it is. There has been a lot of changes in the area, but I wrote a tribute piece to Albert, who passed away recently, called Albert's Dream Machine. And the reason why I called it that was that Albert, prior to George Pedley's daylight sighting, on many nights, consecutive nights, was having this recurring nightmare, being woken up of seeing a UFO land in Horseshoe Lagoon. Now, working with the Close Encounter group that did the Close Encounter series, we did a recreation of that. They didn't quite get the nest and the UFO right, but they're close. But they did a pretty good job of recreating Albert's experience and George's bonding and emotional experience, that kind of thing. So they did it all right, but not so good on the actual nest or the UFO. A work in progress. 1969 was really what kicked me off big time in terms of the physical evidence on the north coast of New South Wales, near my hometown of Grafton, at a place called Bunga, on the property of the member of House of Representatives, parliamentarian Ian Robertson, who was actually a family friend. He told me about this, and I joined a cast of a few hundred people that tramped out to Bunga and saw this big flattened area of saccharine crop on the property, and there you can see the headline. It went viral, so to speak, in those early days. A Australia-wide news story: did a flying saucer land here? Well, there was lots of evidence there suggested that it may well have happened, but I also came across years later a drawing that I do here of a UFO close encounter that occurred at Harwood Island, which is not too far away. A woman walking along hears this violent disturbance in the saccharine crop, object above it. She feels as though she's being levitated and lifted off the ground when she's caught in the high beam of this object, or what appears to be like a high beam effect. And then it goes out, and she finds herself still on the ground. She did not go back actually and verify it, but she said while she was standing there, the crop was actually violently swirling around underneath this object. So if people had gone back to that crop area, the likelihood would have been yet another disturbance like what was found at Bunga. At that time, during 1969, there were I counted about 12 to 15 of these physical trace cases scattered around the north coast. Now, this is a case that people have spoken about. Ben's talked about it. This is what I regard as one of the best physical trace cases in Australia, and luckily I was able to get involved with it. As myself with George Blackwell, the witness. You can see the tank in the background, which features in this story. That's a newspaper account that shows Paul Norman and Pat Gilder kneeling down with the witness. They were there fairly soon after the event. Unfortunately, VUFOAs didn't write this up in any detail at all, so very hard to find out the extent of their investigations. But Keith Basterfield, myself and Gary Little went there about a month or so later and did a detailed case investigation that we wrote up in a lot of detail. I was truly impressed with this case. It really hung together physically. The witness was impressive. There were other people that had some sort of possible verification for the event. But as a chemist, it was kind of like a gift, a real gift, this as a physical trace case, because everything about it was so fascinating. This is from Channel 9 footage. They flew a helicopter over the top and took aerial shots of it as well. Myself again with George Blackwell. That photo shows that you should always come prepared with a field investigation. Usually go in duplicate, have multiple recording equipment, because more often than not, as coincidence often happens, your primary recording equipment breaks down and you have a backup. So that's the reason why I'm lugging around this huge tape recorder during this investigation. But we got a hell of a lot of documentation. We stayed there all day from about 9 in the morning till 4 or 5 in the afternoon. And George was such a wonderful witness. We recreated the entire event on foot, walked with him. He actually was woken up by an object that, or a sound of a disturbance in the cattle, livestock. Hears this strange noise and then goes outside, sees this unusual dish-shaped object, a clearly physical object, not a light, just a structured object. Moving down along the property, it actually moved to avoid a large hay barn, and then you can see there in the middle of the picture, off in the distance there, a 10,000 gallon concrete water tank. That object actually sat on top of that water tank, and then after a few minutes then moved off and sat on the ground. Now, being the caretaker of the property, George was kind of obligated to go and check it out. Now there's Keith and the witness there, showing that there were slight little fractures in the side of the concrete water tank, but certainly not enough to drain that water tank. The water tank was found empty of water, with a large cone-shaped pile of silt in the middle of the water tank. Now, the water tank normally conventionally drains from the side, so why would you get a cone shape of silt in the middle of the water tank? A lot of other unusual aspects of this case. Just a bit of a site drawing done by Keith. Us doing Keith there and myself and others doing our field grid work and to do soil samples. Comparison inside the circle and outside the circle that was found there where the UFO had landed. George rode his motorbike up to within 10-15 metres of the object while it was still on the ground, and at that point he became so frightened that he sat there on his motorbike. The thing took off, tilted, hit him with a blast of hot air. At that stage he said he felt like a plate of jelly, almost collapsed, and the object moves away from the landing site and disappeared, went off into the distance. A very, very striking close encounter. Now, fortunately there were other cases where farmers reported water loss, and strange marks on the ground. This one here, I believe, was explainable as a kind of a fungal ring type of effect. There was something of the order of about 5 to 10 of these circles. When you look at these, you can find out about them pretty easily by digging down and getting the fungal mycelium out of the ground, the white webbing, all that kind of stuff. And so we had a convenient comparison point. We did some chemistry on it and some comparisons, particularly in terms of chloride analysis, that kind of thing. There weren't many differences that we could find other than the chloride differences, and the Rosedale case seemed pretty different to the Montgomery Park case. So we had a pretty clear indication that this wasn't caused by conventional means like a fungal fairy ring, that kind of thing. Now, as I said, physical traces are rare because of being drowned out by crop circle stories and crop circle finds, that kind of thing, but they still do happen, and some of them are very bizarre and strange. Now, this one's a very recent one from 2008 in Coogee. Now, Coogee is one of the more popular beaches in Sydney, and we're talking built-up suburban area, a very busy travelled road. Gentleman walking home late at night at, I think it was 4 a.m. in the morning, classic time for close encounters, but he sees this bizarre object, a spherical object with a kind of a porthole or window effect at the top with a being or a creature seemingly operating some sort of control, sitting there in the middle of this intersection. And he's terrified, you know, he thinks, what the hell is this? And it was of that physical size, and that's a picture of me standing on the location. Now this object sat there, the guy hides behind a traffic light control box, and then this thing takes off, dismissed. Now, interesting as a physical trace point of view, there is a damaged area of bitumen in the middle of the road where the object sat. The telephone pole to the left-hand side was taken out and replaced within days of this event, and the trees behind had burnt bark and all that kind of stuff as well. So, very interesting physical trace. So they still do happen, but they are rare. Now, this case was really fascinating because of the shape and the description. Now, this guy was so uninformed about the UFO subject, but when he told me what he saw, I was really struck by his description, because the correlation with these two classic cases, Cusack in 1967 in France, of the little beings coming out of the object. This case inspired Dr. Claude Puard to form the official French UFO agency, JAPAN. So he was so obsessed with this case, skeptics tried to explain this as a helicopter, with the only problem with this is that like a helicopter doing soldiers' manoeuvres or SAS type guys coming out of the object and going back into it via tethers and whatever, highly unlikely, because the entities were flying up, floating into the air and coming into the top of the object. Now, if you ever want to go crazy or kill yourself, a great way to get killed very quickly is to go into the top of a helicopter. Would be very, very messy. The other case at Gosstown in 1973 in New York State, one of many, many entity cases that occurred in the huge wave that swept across America in 1973, one of the big, great American UFO waves. Now, next category of cases, alien abduction cases, very difficult area to work in, but really incredibly rewarding in terms of research and data. Now, I'm only going to talk about two cases. I've investigated hundreds of cases. Peter Curie's experience, particularly in 1992. We've got Peter here today, so you'll get the chance to meet him as well. Peter and I have become pretty close friends, and we share a lot of investigations these days. A really good guy to have, to be able to work with, but his experience here was just extraordinary from my point of view as a physical chemist, a scientist, because it represented a really interesting opportunity to test the validity of the actual evidence. And in this case, there was a hair sample related to the event, and we studied that did a lot of DNA work. It was the first recorded, or at least publicly available, DNA study of biological evidence related to an alien abduction experience. Now, I said to Peter, this could go badly because it might not confirm the validity of the story, and if it turns out to be entirely prosaic or straightforward, you've got some explaining to do to your wife. But he was quite firm about the fact that he wanted this studied, and what shocked us was that it came out very, very unusual. This is the first report I did on it, the International UFO Reporter, IUR, and it showed evidence of unusual DNA sequences, totally unexpected in a blonde hair sample because it was rare Mongolian Asian DNA. So we weren't expecting that in a blonde hair sample. It got really weird when we started to do the root hair sequence, because it gave us evidence that we were dealing with a hybrid hair sequence. These are the two sequences from the shaft and the root. Anybody who wants detail, read the book. Also evidence suggestive of what's called CCR5 deletion factor, which gives your travelling alien a very interesting kind of property that you might be impervious to troublesome human diseases like HIV, smallpox, that kind of thing. If you've got CCR deletion factor, and probably most of the people in this room wouldn't have it, but it's a fairly rare sequence in the human genome, but it does occur in pockets around the world, and that allows you to be impervious to things like HIV and smallpox. So, great thing to have. This turning up in the hair sequence was pretty bizarre. So, unfortunately, because the sample was slightly degraded, it wasn't 100% conclusive, but interestingly enough, and this summarises some of the sequences, but we were always fascinated by the rare Chinese DNA sequence, and that became part, for me, probably the longest case investigation I've been doing, and it's still ongoing, been going on now for 15 years or something now. It's been going for a long, long time, in which I've been studying what's called the alien DNA paradigm, a hypothesis that maybe aliens or whatever are tinkering around with our DNA. And this represents interesting evidence, but as a scientist, it's only one piece of evidence. I would be much more comfortable with hundreds of examples of this, but we've only got this one example. We've looked at a lot of different cases. This is the one case that's provided really compelling information. Now that DNA, we figured out, seemed to be correlated with one tribal group of people in a small community located in northern Thailand and southern China. So luckily we were able to get some funding, and we were able to go to China and to Thailand, get a lot of field investigations there in Thailand and China. Pretty exhaustive, arduous kind of investigation, but really interesting. And we met up with a lot of the Lahu, did some studies. I won't go into the details because it's a bit delicate in terms of certain details, but we were able to get some samples, and we did some DNA work on that. It seemed to correlate with some of the DNA that we got in the hair sample. This is northern Thailand, and this is southern Yunnan province in China, taking samples, that kind of thing. Now, at the time when I wrote Hair of the Alien in 2005, I wasn't able to identify the DNA scientists involved. A lot of people made sort of stupid remarks like, Bill did it on a bench in his backyard kind of stuff, really stupid sort of kind of comments, but the scientist involved with it was a well-reputed author or co-author of the kind of standard textbook on understanding DNA, and that's Dr. Horace Drew from the CSIRO, one of the leading research scientists. So very powerful kind of endorsement of the work that was done. Now, a much more recent case is quite bizarre. It has paranormal kind of connections, but very complex alien abduction scenario. These are some of the notes that Rob Tilley, a friend of mine, who introduced me to the story. Unlike a lot of UFO stories, it didn't come from the UFO community or from that kind of thing. It came from a psychic research group. Now we've got fairly complex aspects: UFOs, entities, missing pregnancy, implants, multi-generational abductions, right through this whole family. I took a particular interest in an ailing orange tree in their backyard where, it's a bit sad, but the fetal remains, or at least of the umbilical cord, was buried underneath this orange tree. The tree then started to die very quickly. I suggested that they didn't eat the oranges, but umbilical material is very rich in DNA, but so I'm still got an interest in possibly digging that tree up and looking for biological evidence, but it's a long shot, but we hope to carry on with that one. Now, she did a CAT scan, ultrascan, showed evidence of what appeared to be kind of an implant type device. Also, there was scanning done of the fetus that went missing at about 3 or 4 months pregnancy. So it's a very interesting, complex case that could be a very powerful example of the alien abduction experience. Now, to get into very quickly into one area, angel hair, a really interesting area for me because I had an experience in 1969 in Grafton where a number of people in Grafton witnessed a UFO, but I didn't witness that. I saw this angel hair, fine, white, fibrous, cobweb-like material coming down over the water. I actually handled this material, probably because I was going to be a budding chemist in a few years' time. I rolled it up into a ball, smelt it and all that kind of stuff. I didn't eat it, but I tried to assess what this was, and there were great, huge amounts of this coming down. I thought spider's web, that was my assumption, spider's webs. But when I started to handle this, and I had a great ball of it in my hand, I had it in my hand, and it did what chemists refer to as sublimation. It went from solid to gas. Now, I've never seen, over decades since then, spider's web do that. Now, you can roll it up, spider's web, and it'll get smaller and smaller, but it's not going to disappear on you. And so for years I've been trying to duplicate that, and a close call was at Quirindi in 1998, but again, unfortunately contaminated by a UFO hotline service, nothing to do with the AFORN hotline service, that caused the witness to mangle the sampling in this case, and I think it was contaminated by spider's web. It was like a rerun of the famous 1952 Oloron case in France, where you see this cylinder-shaped, dumbbell-shaped cylinder object and smaller objects and all these waves of angel hair or fine white cobweb material coming out of that would disappear. I collaborated with French researcher Gildas Bordeaux to do a recreation for the Close Encounter series. So if you get a chance to see the season 1 and season 2, there are a lot of really interesting attempts at recreating some of these famous cases. And that's Gildas and myself and the recreation of the Oloron case. In the Quirindi case, unfortunately, the angel's hair, whatever it was, when I examined it, was extremely stable, and I came to the conclusion that it was spider's web. But there's a long story to it. If you read the previous issue, the last 1 or 2 issues, I've done a report on all this because there was a recent case at Goulburn in May 2015, and luckily the witness, Ian Watson, was very cooperative and took samples. It was pretty clearly correlated to me as being a spiderweb paw, even down to the point of photograph that he took. He wasn't just seeing one spider, he was seeing literally hundreds of spiders. He called this one Spidey. And he was really cooperative, and he took samples, and we were able to get those samples and examine them and do a detailed investigation. That's photographs of myself doing some work on the sample. And conclusion, it's all written up in this issue that just came out recently, UFOs and Angel's Hair in Search of Evidence. Now that'll give you a good summary of all these cases that I've been talking about. Now, government cases, I'll very quickly go through it. A couple of cases only. Myself with the RWF files in 1982 through to 84. Tracked down Harry Turner, who was a government scientist working for the Joint Intelligence Organisation. Did a secret study in 1954. So in that secret report, he concluded that the UFO investigation done by the RAAF was highly suggestive of extraterrestrial craft. Now that was a secret report written back in 1954 by a government scientist seconded to study the Air Force files. So something was going on. So that's part of his conclusion. Now the famous Drury film, this is like the holy grail of early ufology, with this missing film that was taken by Tom Drury, the Deputy Director of Department of Civil Aviation in Papua New Guinea, close friends with the resident ASIO chief, Laurie Sheedy, was involved in a plane crash together, and he kind of saved Laurie's life, so you do become good friends under those circumstances. I talked to Laurie back in the 80s, talked to Tom Drury back in the 80s as well. These are frames from the film. Large parts of the film are missing, but it's not that good a film. It's a Super 8 film, shows a streak of light. Edgar Jarrell, the early pioneer researcher, I think was responsible for misrepresenting the film, I think, because he argued that it showed a right angle turn. Now Tom, who took the film, didn't see any of that. There's myself with Paul Drury, Tom Drury's son. He gave us access to the camera that was used by Tom Drury, and this is myself and Robert Fowler, the editor of the Ufologist magazine, examining the camera that Tom Drury took. I wrote this report up in some detail in a two-part article back in 2001, I think, well, a long time ago. And conclusions, that's Tom's comment to me. He felt it was like, he said it wasn't a bloody flying saucer, it was like a missile. That's what he thought it was. Now, we weren't able to identify it. It wasn't out of Woomera, it wasn't one of ours. So we really don't know what it was, but I don't think it was an extraterrestrial flying saucer. One of the famous radar visual cases from 1954 by Seamus Farrell, a naval sea pilot. Now, I'll talk briefly about Northwest Cape. There's an Australian fire captain. Bill Lynch is a photograph that Paul and Keith got hold of recently of the fire captain, and independently the deputy commander of the base at Northwest Cape, a highly sensitive US joint facility with Australia. 1973, October, same day that the base was used to issue a full nuclear alert to US forces in the Pacific region, Indian Ocean region as well. And unusually there was a UFO sighting. A dish-shaped object hovering to the west of the base. There's an NSA report on whether the NSA were taken to court to try and get their files. There's a reference to a 1973 case that's, as you can see, all the information is pretty much blacked out, so we think it's related to Northwest Cape, we're not sure. Cover-up cases, well, you've got a classic case here in Melbourne, of course, with the Westall case. But here's a conversation taken out of the Petrov story written by Michael Belogowski, who was the ASIO go-between informant that brought in Petrov, the Russian spy that defected back in 1954. And there was a conversation that they were having, one of these conversations that I would have loved to have sat in, a drunken conversation, a lot of beer and vodka being drunk, and one of the KGB spy guys inside the Russian embassy saying to Belogowski, whose Asia code name was Diablo, kind of suits him, but and they were talking about anecdotes, and the Russian said, oh yeah, all these flying saucer sightings, yeah, some of them are made by Russia. And immediately Petrov turned around to the other Russian spy and said, shut up. And he promptly shut up, and Belogowski thought, well, very strange comment to make, flying saucers may be made by the Russians or whatever. But these sort of stories, there's thousands of these cover-up stories, and most of them are very hard to verify, but the Westall story is an interesting one because there are lots of suggestions of cover-ups and suppression of witness stories, that kind of stuff. People told to shut up, that kind of thing. The school teacher, the science teacher, Andrew Greenwood, told to shut up at the risk of his career, that kind of thing. He was interviewed by James MacDonald in 1967, 1 year after Westall happened. Now, one of the most interesting witnesses for me was Victor Zachary, who described being a school kid at Westall and having seen it on the ground and walked around the object and almost touched it. Now, I spent a lot of time with Victor at Westall School doing a forensic recreation of his experience, and that's my drawing of what he saw. A whole bunch of people along the school fence, 2 objects on the ground, him and a few other schoolboys standing around the objects, and one goes up, circles a Cessna flying over and takes off, the other one flies up and lands in the Grange. Now, Victor went home, unlike all the other students who hung around the school, all excited about what happened. The reason why he did that, I thought was pretty unusual. He said, no, well, I didn't need to see it again because I'd already seen it a couple of years earlier. As a kid, he's down a local factory site at midnight stealing a couple of wooden pallets trying to make a billy cart, as you would as a kid. And he sees this object flying along on its side. Now, that had been reported and experienced by a number of people in that area over the years between 1963 and 66. And here's this well-known daylight photograph taken by a gentleman that probably a number of you already know here. But it's a daylight photograph. Baldwin, yes, of course, yeah. Taken within a couple of days of the Westall school case. Now, the sideways orientation, that's very important, because if you look at a book called X Descending, in that there's a study of a photograph or a film taken by a friend of mine, Ray Stanford, who's been in the UFO community for decades, longer than me. He wrote the book on the Socorro case. There's going to be a lot more coming out on the Socorro case, but Hynek endorsed Ray Stanford's investigation. Ray Stanford did a lot of scientific investigations. Here am I with Hynek. Alan Hynek had endorsed Ray's book. And the film that he took showed this object moving on its side, but with this projected beam out the front. Now, that becomes very significant because a scientist working with NASA in some secret research work, they were trying to develop a certain type of propulsion that involved a laser beam pushing an object along out in space. Now, this scientist, Dr. Leek Marabo, visited Ray Stanford because he heard about the film that Ray had taken, and he examines the film. He was there at Ray's house for 2 days, wrote out all this endorsement for Ray and gave him a lot of documentation, and then suddenly the whole course of this NASA scientist's research shifted. Instead of having a laser light pushing the spacecraft, they now had this object projecting a beam of energy out the front of the craft. This is what Ray filmed, and Marabo and NASA deny that there was any connection to Ray Stanford's film, but to have the whole trajectory of research suddenly change within a year, completely from being pushed behind to projecting out in front, breaking down, I guess, the air barrier and all that kind of stuff, or whatever. It sort of shows that UFO evidence can actually support breakthrough technology. And there's a bit of a war going on at the moment between Chris Lambright, who wrote the book X Descending, trying to confirm that, yes, this paper trail does exist. And it's a very impressive documentation. So if you get a chance, read the e-book X Descending. It's quite a fascinating work. And this is part of the timetable of the argument I've just been describing, that contrary to the 1969 Connor report, something of value can emerge from the study of UFO reports. Foreign cases, Chinese case, I'll very quickly go through this one. A very powerful alien abduction case involving this gentleman here who I met in Beijing in 2006. Involved in a complex case. One of the few English-speaking Chinese researchers was the first investigator. He was abducted, encountered a young Chinese girl inside the craft. They located her through am I getting the wind up? Yep. Or was that Twilight Zone music? Good one. Myself in Beijing interviewing Professor Ma, the first investigator. my interpreter in Beijing, Irene, translating a lot of the case material. The therapist who hypnotised this guy. This was all material courtesy of my Beijing researcher friend Zhang Jinping. Regression, lie detector test, which he passed. Also worked with a police sketch artist. They got a sketch done of the young girl that this guy claims he encountered on board the UFO, where there was an attempt to heal her with this kind of curtain or raincoat effect of solid light. Very bizarre story. They found the girl courtesy of about 200 university students wandering through this area trying to use this identikit picture to find her. And they found this girl that, unfortunately, she had a few mental impairments, but she had disappeared, been found with strange marks on her back. And this is the witness and the girl together. Very complicated case. Now, a lot of cases that come out and you see on the internet about China are just crazy. They're complete distortions, misrepresentations, hoaxes, that kind of thing. And here's a classic one that involved a story about a UFO stopping and shutting down a whole airport. Now, they've had numerous airport shutdowns due to UFOs, but most of them are courtesy of Chinese young millionaires flying their own private planes, etc., and going into controlled corridors, etc., and not filing a flight plan, all that kind of stuff. So, flying in China skies sometimes can be a bit dicey. Now, I'm just going to finish off with a focus on something that I've been working on for the last 5 to 10 years, solid light cases. Now, solid light is an aspect of the UFO phenomenon that's been around for a long, long time, but not well understood and not studied very extensively. And I'm just going to cover very quickly 3 cases. What it involves is the projection of what appears to be like light projected out of a UFO. It usually is basically non-divergent, like a tube, but it doesn't behave like light as we know it. It can be slow progression, slowly projects out, it's truncated at the end. It certainly doesn't behave like light as we know it. Now, there's lots of cases where these solid light beams seem to be used as transport to deliver a being to the ground, like in Imajärvi in Finland in 1970. A famous case involved 2 Finnish skiers. Wanke in New York in 1966. An anonymous photograph taken in France in 1974. Now this is one from Corpus Christi, taken by Ray Stanford. Now he hasn't released the film, but he allowed me to use this frame from the film that shows this projection of this solid beam coming out of the object. Now Barry Taylor here showed me some interesting imagery today of a similar effect being taken here quite recently by himself. Trencaz, the mother of all solid light cases, very controversial. Some Argentine researchers suggest this was all caused by an arc spotlight harassing a small farming property. It doesn't seem likely, but it's a very powerful case. Quebec in Canada, 1967, a very strange solid light case involving a young boy and creating a curtain, a bell jar effect around the UFO. A lot of these cases I've been involved with the Close Encounter channel to recreate, so if you catch up with that series 1 and 2, you'll see a lot of these cases described in that series. Tassie in France in 1972, another one that was recreated by the Close Encounter series. Now, back to Melbourne, 1954, a very experienced pilot, Douglas Barker, sees on January 1st the first flying saucer sighting of the year in a massive wave that took place across Victoria, a thing that he describes as a flying mushroom. Now, this seemed to project something out of the bottom. There was like some sort of observation cart underneath it, or a vehicle, or some sort of device underneath it. He was somewhat ridiculed by a lot of people. The aviation department said it was a Convair aircraft. He said, no way was this a Convair aircraft, because he flew these every single day, and he was a very experienced observer. He saw this from the ground outside his house. If you want to read about that, I've written an account in UFO Truth magazine, a digital magazine that comes out of the UK. Booyup Brook in Western Australia, 1969, or 67 rather. Very powerful solid light case and stopping a car at the same location that was well known in 1957, 58 for a massive poltergeist outbreak. Some of these correlations are quite striking, and in this case, a friend of mine, well, two friends of mine, Tony Healy and Paul Cropper, have written a book called Australian Poltergeist, which summarises the Australian experience in poltergeist. One of the key cases is Booyup Brook, and he gets into it a little bit of detail about the UFO aspect. Very interesting case. Dr. X, very famous French case involving solid light and healing, that kind of thing. Very strange case. Read the detail. It's written up in a lot of books and on websites and that kind of stuff. Again, it was recreated, partially at least, in the Close Encounter series, and I was involved with that with Gildas Bordeaux again to try and get a sense of the story in it. And they did actually fairly well in that one. Very unusual case, solid light, triangular marks on the witness and his young son, healing, psychic, paranormal effects. These are scenes from the Close Encounters recreation. Aspects of that case have occurred here as well in Australia. Case I investigated at Earlwood in Sydney, 2007, Australia Day. Now, I thought this had to be an F-111 afterburner that I knew was in the area, but the witness, who was a trained nurse, and there were other witnesses there as well, saw this object come down over the top of the house, in between that house that you can see in the photograph and their veranda that they're standing on. Now, if it had been an F-111 doing this, the effect would have been catastrophic. It would have been the whole house and everything, and the plane would have been written off. Very strange case, but it departed in exactly the same way as the Dr. X case in France, where it seemed you have this large structured object moving between the two houses, below the roof line, and then going up above the roof line, and then seemingly just crumpling and seemingly starting to disappear in a fog effect. And then there was like a shotgun effect of a red ball of light that went straight up into the air and disappeared. Now, that's what occurred in the Dr. X case in France as well. And the other correlation is a case that I've spent years investigating at Kiama, what I regard as one of the best solid light cases in Australia. Very complicated case. People up on the headland in a house seeing a UFO display. One witness in particular has an entity aspect to it as well, abduction case, people on the beach with the UFO shining a solid light down onto them, and these people seem to be trapped in this kind of strange light that was surrounding them. Here's some drawings. The object projected this solid light down onto a toilet block onto the beach. There's a whole series of cabins there, and it seemed to, once it hit the toilet block, it seemed to melt like honey running over the toilet block. Entities in the object. Here's some field investigations at Kiama. I actually, by accident, found the father-in-law of the witness, who was a very evasive, difficult to get hold of guy. I've interviewed him a couple of times, but meeting his father was a real liberation. He confirmed the story. A case that was covered in the first season of Close Encounters. A solid light case, car stop at Port Jarvis, investigated by MUFON, Chuck Moderlin and Richard Lang. And curiously, I wasn't even interviewed for that particular episode, but I turned up in the episode talking about solid light. So I think I got the Close Encounters people to get obsessed with solid light cases, because the solid light cases are an element of UFOs that's not well known, but if you look at season 1 and season 2, there are a lot of solid light cases, so, and that's probably courtesy of my obsession. Now, just closing, here is a very striking case that could be like a trigger for a major scientific development hidden within the Chinese defence community, intelligence community. back in 1998, the Chinese Air Force were conducting a trial of a supersonic drone. Now, they just modified a supersonic aircraft, and it was a remote-controlled vehicle. The leading father of Chinese drones, Dr. Zhao Yu, was there as a witness as well, and a lot of the military people were there, and quite a lot of scientists. And during that trial, the UFO appears, and it projected these two beams of what appear to be solid light out of the object. Now, General Lee, the commander of the base, makes this comment. Surprisingly, these two bright beams of light were not as we normally see light beams, as has been according to the distance and spread, but as two light-emitting entities sticking out of the bottom of the UFO, ending on a certain length. Remember, I talked about truncated beams of light? At least today, we have not got control of this sort of light technology. Now, I've seen evidence privately and through various connections in China that China is making major headways in what we see in science fiction terms as tractor beams, you know, the ability to be able to take hold of physical objects with certain types of beams of light and picking them up. So-called, at this stage, the best that we can do is to pick up the equivalent of a dust particle. But the Chinese have made a major breakthrough that not only can we move it using this kind of modified light beam, they can actually pick it up. So that seems pretty trivial by UFO standards, but that's where we're currently at. So maybe UFO solid light cases represent a major potential breakthrough in technology. If we have that technology, then there'd be some major breakthroughs going on. And Nature magazine and others are playing around with the whole concept of solid light and stopping light and manipulating light and doing it into kind of digital kind of computer networks using kind of light and all that kind of thing. So it's a major research area. And that's it, folks. So I can only do a very light touch, but there's a lot of material out there that are made available, books, websites, blog posts, all that kind of stuff. So there's plenty of ways to find out a little bit more detail about it. So that's a very small part of 45 years of experience with UFOs in Australia and around the world. Thank you very much.